This is my small but very mighty camera collection. It has some gems, some absolute money wasters, some cheap finds, and some really good all-rounder cameras that I would recommend to absolutely everybody. In this video, I will show you each camera in my collection, the photos I took with this camera, explain to you what the camera is good for, what it's bad for, give an individual score, and tell you if I would recommend for you to buy this camera or not. This is the first camera that I ever bought, and it's roughly 40 years old. It is the Minolta X-300 35mm SLR analog camera that's fully manual. It has an MD Minolta mount, and it was produced between 1984 and 1990. I then proceeded to work with this camera for 2 years. I only shot on this camera. It was my main camera. I was mostly taking portraits of actors, of friends. I was shooting on film sets and anything random that came in front of my lens that I could learn from. I own 2 lenses for this camera, a 50mm lens and a 28mm lens. And actually the 50mm focal length is to this day still one of my favorite focal lens ever to shoot with. This camera cost me 200 euros when I first bought it, and I bought it in a pretty good condition in a used camera store for analog cameras here in Berlin. Let's go ahead and rate this camera according to the categories that I have written down. And the first category is price. So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, I would rate it about an 8 for price, because I think 200 euros is nothing crazy, but it's an okay amount for a camera like this one that you can basically learn how to shoot photography on. And this camera can do anything that you need it to do. The next category is the beauty score. And I would say that camera is a pretty beautiful camera. I think it has the classic analog camera style and nothing crazy, nothing too fancy, but you can tell it's a classic camera design. So I would rate it a 9 out of 10. It's pretty lightweight, this camera. So in terms of portability, you can just throw it into your camera bag in a backpack, or just wear it around your body, like crossbody, or around your neck. I would say in terms of portability, it's 10 out of 10. Let's talk about the applications of the camera. You have already seen some of the example photos that I shot on this camera, and I would say it has a wide range of application. You can shoot anything that you want with this camera, and it's a pretty good tool. However, let's talk about the film thing. So this camera only shoots film. So in this day and age, I would say this limits its applications, because we all know film is incredibly expensive these days. So let's give it for application a good 5 out of 10. In terms of the results, my opinion is that you can have some incredible results with this camera, and that is due to the analog thing, but also because it has some really good lenses, and you can also adapt some newer lenses, a little adapter ring. So in terms of unique results, I would say for me, it's a 9 out of 10. The overall score, or let's call it the kitty score, because I'm Kitty, friends call me Kitty. Let's call it the kitty score. So that is a 41 points. Let's move on to the second camera. This is the bougiest single-use camera that I ever owned. And it's the Ilford HP5 Single-Use camera. And obviously it shoots only black and white film, Ilford HP5 Plus. I picked this camera up and it came in a pack of 3. So I have 2 of these cameras left, and I've shot it once before. I used it to shoot my partner playing basketball outside, just to test out the camera and see what it can do. And it produced some pretty grainy results. Let's be honest. I ended up liking the photos that this camera produced, but in terms of the entire concept of this camera, I'm not sure. It shoots 27 frames, so it has 27 exposures on this camera. It has like a tiny wide angle lens. It has the capability to shoot flash. And beyond that, nothing much is happening here. Today, this camera costs a whopping 19.99 euros, about $20 on Amazon. And you know, it's a cool gift. It's something that you can play around with, but you could also say it's a bit of a money waste, especially because you can get a normal Ilford HP5 Plus film and you will have more exposures on that roll of film if you just plug it into your point and shoot or your SLR. Let's still go through the scores for this camera. So in terms of the price, I would rate this camera at about 3 points because I think the price for a single-use camera is pretty high. In terms of the beauty score, I mean, it doesn't really look very good. It looks like a cheap plastic single-use camera. I mean, the colors are not as aggressive as on some of the other cameras that you can find in the segment, but still, it's not a beauty. So let's give it a 1 out of 10. In terms of portability, yes, it's super light and portable. Let's give it a 10 out of 10. In terms of the applications, you can't do very much with this camera. You cannot change any settings beyond choosing between flash and no flash. So it has a very limited application as sort of like a gimmick or like a party thing. Let's give it 2 out of 10. In terms of unique results, I think you can play around with this camera and get some pretty unique results. So I would rate it a 7 out of 10. And that gives us a kitty score of 23 points out of 50. So not very good. Let's move on. But before I show you the next camera, if you're enjoying this type of content, please give this video a little tap on the like button and I can make more videos just like this one and subscribe to the channel. This little camera right here is one of the most iconic point and shoot cameras out there, and it is the Olympus Miu 1. It is not as famous as its sibling, the Miu 2, but the Miu 1 is also a very thought out camera. The Olympus Miu 1 was issued sometime in the mid-90s and they produced quite a big batch of these cameras. It is a 35mm lens with a 3.5 aperture. It has a couple flash settings and it has quite a ridiculous price tag. So when I bought this camera, I bought it for about 130 euros, but that was in 2019. These days, this camera goes for roughly 300 euros online. Of course, you can always find it cheaper if the condition is worse, but that's the price tag these days. I've used this camera to kind of pop it into my bag and carry it around to shoot some casual party-like situations. It is a cool kid of the point-and-shoot cameras out there, but honestly, I've been pretty underwhelmed with its performance. The autofocus on this camera is pretty awful, and in a lot of situations when I was trying to photograph a person, the camera would focus on the wall behind that person, and of course, because you're shooting on film, you have no way to see and control that, and you're getting back film where the focus is completely off. So let's rate this camera. In terms of price, I think this camera is doing pretty badly. So I would rate it at a 1 out of 10 because I believe this camera is pretty overpriced. The beauty score, okay, I can give it to Olympus. They have created a very beautiful, sleek design. In terms of the beauty score, I would give it an 8 out of 10. The portability, again, is great. I guess as with most of my cameras, I do tend to pick cameras that are pretty small, lightweight, and that I can carry around. Just because I have small hands, I'm a pretty small person. So this camera fits right in, and I would give it a 10 out of 10. In terms of application, as I mentioned, if you're a point and shoot lover, you might find that you get everything that you need from this camera. But if you are just a standard photographer, I think it's a unnecessary tool. If it would work properly and the focus would perform like you wanted to, would be a very good camera, but I would say it has a limited application. I would only rate it a 1 out of 10. In terms of unique results, I mean, the results are pretty unique if you like to focus on the background instead of the person. So I would rate it a 1 out of 10 here, and that gives us an overall kitty score of 21 out of 50. So I'd say don't buy this camera, save your money for something else. And actually, I should consider selling this camera because of how useless it actually is. This camera, absolute best point and shoot camera that I have ever owned. It's also the first point and shoot camera that I ever bought. It is the Konica A4 point and shoot camera with a 35mm 3.5 lens. This camera is pretty easy to use. You just pop it open, pop in some film, and a pretty unique feature is that you can change between the minimum focal distance. You can change between 0.35 meters and 0.6 meters, which is like a pretty close focal distance. This camera was released in 1989, so it's pretty darn old. It's about as old as I am, 35 years. And when I bought this camera in one of my favorite stores, it cost me about 80 euros, which I think is reasonable for a point and shoot film camera these days. I'm also pretty sure you can find this camera for about the same price. It's not one of these like hot point and shoot cameras that everybody wants to get, so it is a decent price tag today. I have personally shot some of my favorite point and shoot images on this camera, including mostly portraits, but also kind of like casual situations. I think if you want to own a point and shoot camera, this is a reasonable model to look at, so let's rate this camera. In terms of price, as I mentioned, it's a pretty good deal, so I would rate it 10 out of 10. The beauty score, I mean, I'm not sure. I put a sticker on my camera just because I think it looked a little bit boring. And I guess in terms of the beauty score, that puts it at a solid, let's give it a 5. Portability, again, 10 out of 10. It's lightweight, it's small, ideal. In terms of its application, I mean, being a point and shoot camera and a film camera, again, it's pretty limited, but it does what it says on the package, so I would give it a 3. In terms of the unique results, I do really like the results this camera produces, so I would give it a 9 out of 10. This gives us an overall score for the Konica A4 of 37 out of 50. This camera can absolutely make or break your day. It is a heavy hitter, a brick, an absolute giant of a camera, and it is the legendary Pentax 6.7. There were 2 versions of this camera made, the later one and the earlier one, and one of them has a mirror lock-up function. This one actually has the mirror lock-up function, and thank God, because the mirror is giant and it produces a ton of camera shake. This camera, big, it's too big for my hands actually. It's super heavy, it's bulky, cannot fit in anything properly unless you have like a giant backpack or a camera carrier. It has a horrifically dark viewfinder and it has absolutely impossible flash sync speeds, 1/30th of a second. It will absolutely destroy your tripod if you try to put it in portrait mode, but, and it's a bit but, it has the best glass out there to take incredible portraits with beautiful bokeh, and it has some of the best subject to background separations that you will find out there because of its 6:7 format of the frame, and it comes the closest to actually large format cameras. In terms of its use, the battery is really annoying on this camera. It has like this small battery, but every time you have used the camera, it's actually recommended to take out the battery because the camera will drain it if you leave it on accidentally. It uses the battery for the internal light meter that is not accurate at all. So you do need to bring your own light meter if you're using this camera. So this one of the most annoying features actually, I think. The other one is that the mirror gets stuck up from time to time, and then you have to use a little button on this camera to release the mirror. I have to watch YouTube videos on how to do that exactly every time because I tend to forget. So let's talk about the price of this camera. I paid about 2,500 euros for the camera body in mint condition. I ordered it from Japan, and I also got actually 4 lenses with this camera. So I think the price is pretty expensive for a camera that is like over 35 years old, because this is when this camera was produced, sometime in the 90s or even late 80s. And I don't know, it's hard to say if the price is justified. In terms of the results, it's incredible, but I mean, let's give it like a 6 out of 10. In terms of the beauty score, I think it is a beautiful camera, though it's not a very sleek design. It is a very classic camera design, reminiscent of, 35mm SLR cameras. And that's actually also how you use this camera and how you load the film. Let's not digress. In terms of the beauty score, I would give this a solid 7 out of 10. The portability of this camera, I mentioned it before, it is horrific. It's heavy. I haven't found a good way how to carry this camera. I sometimes carry it on the strap across the body, and I find that's probably even the best way to carry this camera. I don't have a very good camera backpack, so maybe that's actually my own fault. But, there's no denying it's super heavy and bulky. Let's give it a 1 out of 10 here for portability. In terms of its application, I mean, let's be honest, it is a film camera. It's beautiful for portraits, and I'm sure you can also use it beautifully for landscapes. I haven't done that much yet. But, as soon as you go indoors, or if you need to shoot it in a studio with flash, you'll run into the limitations of this camera. So I would give it like a 4 out of 10. Unique results, I would agree this camera produces some of the best portrait results that I have seen out there in terms of film cameras. So I would definitely rate it a 10 out of 10 for results. This gives us an overall score for the Pentax 6.7 of, I didn't expect this, it is a measly 28 out of 50. Though I do kind of love this camera, it is a love-hate relationship. And would I recommend anybody to buy this camera? I'm not sure. I would recommend anybody to try and use this camera. Maybe if you can borrow it from a friend, try it like a couple times, and then you have to decide whether it is worth the hassle, worth the investment for this camera. I'm not going to get rid of it, that's for sure. But would I buy it again? It's a maybe. It's a solid maybe on this camera. This is a truly old school Polaroid camera, and it is the Polaroid Supercolor 3500 land camera. This is the first and only Polaroid camera that I have ever owned, and it is in my collection because I think taking Polaroids is a ton of fun. I'm not using it to measure any type of exposure. I'm using it if I want to shoot Polaroids for a project, and I've done that a couple of times. It is pretty easy and standard to use like any old Polaroid camera, but this camera has a massive drawback, and that is it doesn't have a built-in flash function. It actually came with these old school, like weird little glass flashes that you can attach on top of this camera to make a flash go off. But I was kind of never prone to use these, even though it it is quite good to have a flash function on a Polaroid camera. So what I have to say with this, you need a lot of light if you are gonna have a proper exposure with this camera. And it is also not the best camera in terms of its focusing capabilities. So this camera was kind of an accidental buy. I didn't really know anything about Polaroid cameras when I got it from my local used camera shop. It had like a reasonable price. It cost me like 50 euros to buy it back then. And in terms of like the newest Polaroid cameras, I think you can spend about 150 euros on those. But of course, they will be modern and have all the cool functions. It is not the smallest camera, and it has this kind of eye viewfinder that is also a little bit annoying to use. I think the design is pretty neat, but let's discuss that when we score that camera. Let's give it a proper score, shall we? So in terms of the price, it was pretty cheap. I would give it a 8 out of 10. The beauty score, as I mentioned, it has that classic Polaroid camera look, old school. It can look, neat and decent on your shelf. So I would give it a 7 out of 10. In terms of portability, it's a bit bulky. The shape is a little bit awkward. So I would give it maybe like a 5 out of 10. Its application, it does what it says on the package. It shoots Polaroid images, and okay ones at that, whatever you can expect from Polaroid cameras, right? So it's limited to that. Let's give it a 2 out of 10. In terms of unique results, I think Polaroid cameras can produce some pretty unique results, especially if you know how to handle that Polaroid film and maybe do some, chemical experiments on it afterwards. In terms of what comes out of the box, it's hit and miss with the focus. So I would give it maybe like a 6 out of 10. What is its overall kitty score for the Polaroid Supercolor? It is on par with the Pentax, 28 out of 50. And I am not sure I'm happy with that result. It scored some points on price. Maybe let's downgrade it a little bit on the unique results. I think I was a bit too generous there. Let's give it maybe like a 3. 25 out of 50, I think, is the most reasonable score probably here. Yeah, let's stick with 25 out of 50. So I saved the best for last, I think, and that is actually my camera that I'm filming on right now. Let's switch to the phone camera so you can see it actually. And that is the Fujifilm X-T4 camera, a digital camera, the first digital camera actually in my entire collection, and the only one that I actually possess myself. So the Fuji X-T4 is the first digital camera that I have bought and used. And let me tell you, it is one of my favorite cameras out there because I can not only do all of my photo work on that tiny camera, but I can also film these YouTube videos and film any video that I want on that camera. It has interchangeable lenses. It has all the normal functions of a good digital camera. It is mirrorless, so it's pretty tiny and compact. It has the most beautiful form factor because it does look like an old analog camera. And let's be honest, this is one of the main reasons why I bought this camera and why I love it so much. One of the major downturns or downfalls of this camera is the APS-C sensor. So it is a crop sensor camera, not a full frame camera. And I really wish that Fuji would make this camera as a full frame camera. I'm not sure why they're not doing it. It is kind of a gap in the Fuji system because they have the X-T4 and X-T5, and then they have the GFX, their medium format camera, but they don't do a full frame camera, unfortunately. If you're listening, Fuji, please make a full frame camera. I think a lot of people would get it. Yeah. What else is there to say about this camera? It has this neat little flip out screen where if you're filming yourself, you can actually see yourself right there. It's perfect for filming yourself or YouTube videos. And yeah, let's go ahead and rate this camera on my rating card. So the Fuji X-T4 comes with a pretty hefty price tag. The body alone, I think, costs roughly 2,000 euros, or that's what it cost me when I got this camera like 3 years ago. I think with the newest model, the X-T5 being out, this camera has priced a little bit, but still for a crop sensor camera, it is a pretty hefty price tag. So I would probably give it like a 6 out of 10 on price. In terms of the beauty score, I think this is one of the most beautiful digital cameras out there, especially considering also its size. And, you know, probably a Leica is up there, but I think the Fuji people have done a really good job with how the camera looks and feels. So in terms of the beauty score, I would give it a 10 out of 10. Portability, chef's kiss, it is pretty amazing. You can throw it on your body, like around your neck. You can throw it into like a tiny bag you're carrying around. Sometimes I just put it in my handbag even. And yeah, it's pretty good, 10 out of 10. In terms of its application, I think this camera is pretty amazing. I mean, the only downfall I think is the crop sensor, but you can use this camera for filming, for vlogging. It's tiny and lightweight. You can use this camera for portraits, for landscapes, for products, anything that you want. This camera will be a good buddy. The autofocus works pretty well on this camera. So it is like one of the best all-rounder cameras that I have ever used. And I have used some other digital cameras before, which I also liked, but they haven't like made me fall in love with them, just like I am with this camera. So it is a 10 out of 10. Unique results. I think because this camera lets you use like filters like you would use actual film in a camera, it gives you like all these film simulations. It produces some pretty unique results straight out of camera. And of course, then you can go ahead and edit the images. But in terms of unique results, I love some of the photos that I have taken on this camera. I believe I have taken some of my best kind of paid work and also like some of my best street photography on this camera. So I would again rate it a 10 out of 10. And this gives us an overall kitty score of 46 out of 50, which is pretty high up there. But, you know, I would say it's justified. It's one of my favorite cameras in my collection. And I would probably recommend this camera to any digital camera beginner that loves the kind of analog look of a camera and also kind of the analog look of the images straight out of the camera. So if you have enjoyed my camera collection video, please subscribe to my channel to signal to me that I should make more similar content like this one for you. And I will see you in my next video up here. Bye bye.